Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the EdTech Lounge. On behalf of the Network of Quality Teaching and Learning, I'd like to welcome all our participants today to the EdTech Lounge. I can see that we've got faculty and lots of staff members. Many of you have been to the EdTech Lounge before. However, if there's anyone who has not been to the EdTech Lounge, the format is very simple. Our speaker of the day will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. And after that, we will open up the session for discussion, for question and answers. During the talk, if you have any questions or if you have any thoughts or comments that you would like to share, please use the chat window. Share your ideas, your questions in the chat, and we will look at the chat window towards the end of the talk. During the talk, please may I request everyone to keep their microphone on mute. Okay, so we're ready to begin now. So today's EdTech Lounge is by Professor Kevin Pitts. Kevin is currently working with us as a consultant for online, blended, and digital learning. Kevin is a faculty member in the Teaching and Learning Center at Seneca College in Toronto. Kevin's responsibilities within the center include teaching in the faculty development programs, such as Foundations of Teaching and Learning, Technology-Enhanced Learning, and Inclusive Teaching and Scholarly Practice. His responsibilities also include developing and facilitating faculty development workshops, consulting with college departments and faculty on curriculum design and development, with particular focus on online and blended learning, and providing expertise in educational technology in relation to special project initiatives. Occasionally, Kevin also teaches courses in mathematics and research methods. Kevin holds a PhD in education, a master's in distance education, and a BEd in adult education, as well as BSc in biology. His research interests include literacy in a digital age, technology-enhanced enabled learning, online and blended learning, and faculty development. Today, Kevin will talk about inclusive online teaching, which is an area that has emerged as an important area at AKU based on the previous EdTech Lounge sessions that our faculty members have conducted and based on all the work that we've done in the last 1 year during the pandemic. And let's hear from Kevin and let's explore the principles of inclusive teaching and the ideas on how we can make our online teaching more inclusive. So welcome, Kevin, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Azra. Thank you for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for the EdTech Lounge for inviting me, and hope everybody is having a great afternoon or morning, and we're going to get right into it. So I'm going to share my screen, and give me 1 second whilst I do that. And hopefully you can see everything okay. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So just let me know in the chat, or Abir or somebody can let me know that you can see my screen okay, and then you can hear me okay. And I can see a couple of thumbs ups, which means we're good to go. All right. So our topic today is inclusive online teaching. And I really want it to be a conversation in terms of our experiences. And one of those issues is to share our experiences with our colleagues so that we can appreciate all of the different nuances that it means to be an online educator. So let's get right into it. I'm going to start off with just a little quick agenda. What we're going to cover today, we're going to do a quick welcome, which we've done already. Some of you have posted in the chat, and it's nice to see where you're from, etc. And keep doing that for sure. And also, if you have any questions along the way, please post them in the chat, and we'll get to those right at the very end. So I'm going to start off with a little review of what is inclusive teaching. We're going to look at the role of educators and the very important role that we have. Then a brief overview of some principles and then some strategies. We want it to be very practical so that we can take something away from the session today that we could implement perhaps tomorrow in our online classes or in our teaching. And then, of course, there's some next steps and Q&A that we can get to. Now, before we begin that, I'd like to get everyone involved here. So I've got a little activity, and we'll have a couple of activities throughout the session today. So let me just go and open this up. This is a Menti activity. Hopefully you can see on the screen, there's the first question. So how you access this is you go to menti.com, and you can either type in that code 91619595, or I think Abir is going to post in a direct link to the voting area. And thanks, Abir, for doing that in the chat. So if you could just go ahead and grab your phone, open up a browser, whatever is the most comfortable for you, and then let us know how you're feeling today. And our options are you relaxed or excited, tired, nervous, hungry, overwhelmed? And of course, there probably could be many, many other options as well in there, but go ahead and answer, and I'll leave the poll open for a little bit. I'm just trying to think how many participants we have today. Some of you may or may not be able to access. That's okay. Just keep going, and I'll open it up for a few seconds there. So how are you feeling today? Good. Responses are coming in. And yes, if you want to go in there, posting in the chat how you're feeling. Very busy, I get that, absolutely. All right, I'll tell you what I'll do. We'll give you another 10 seconds or so to answer this part. How are you feeling today? All right. Great. So here we go. We've got a very diverse group here today in terms of how you're feeling. Some of us are relaxed. Most of us are feeling overwhelmed, and I absolutely get that, because the pandemic has certainly caused us to pivot quite a bit and learn a whole bunch of new things. And so sometimes it can feel overwhelming. Yes, for me, it's morning, so I agree with those that are hungry. I'm glad to see there's a couple of you that are excited, etc., about today, and many are relaxed, and a couple of you are tired as well, for sure. One of the things we do notice, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on, is that when we have our students in our classrooms, they're quite a diverse group, and from day to day, it could be different. They're feeling a little different each day, and we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about inclusive education. So I'll chat about that a little bit more in a second. So one more question, or maybe two more questions before we get into the session. I want to just ask you in terms of, what does inclusive teaching mean to you? So in here, there's a box that you can fill in, and you can either use a word or a phrase, whatever you want, and just kind of let us know what you think inclusive teaching means. Okay. Good. Refers to the pedagogy, okay? Regardless of background or identity. Not excluding anyone. Engagement, okay? Great. Learner-centeredness. Inclusiveness. All the students are included. Absolutely. I love that. Letting all students thrive. Considering student needs. Absolutely. Belonging. Yes. Keep them coming. Okay, let's scroll down a little bit. There's a lot, fast and furious now. Engagement again. for sure. In caps, that must mean it's really important there. Catering to all students, differentiated instruction. Good, good. All right. Give you a couple more minutes to maybe 10 more seconds there to throw in your ideas. And I think we've got a common theme coming in terms of involvement and belonging, those types of things. Awesome. Thanks for doing that. So as we can scroll through the list here, we can see a lot about engagement, including everyone, feeling like you're belonging, taking into account student needs. Great. Okay, let's do one more and then we'll get into the presentation. So here I'm going to shift gears a little bit, maybe here to ask you to think of the best teacher you have had. Maybe you've had a couple of great teachers. I'm sure everyone has. What word best describes that teacher? What word best describes that teacher? And you can enter one or two or three words, whatever you think, and we'll get a little word cloud coming up here in terms of what word best describes that teacher. Okay, here we go. We're starting to come in. Good. Good. Yes. So I'm looking at that, and the big words are, things like caring. Someone who is really sincere and caring about the success of their students. Friendly, kind, motivator, respectful, humble, encouraging. All these types of words are really important because when you think about the teacher's traits, how many of us, I'm just trying to think if we can look in there, how many talked about their discipline knowledge or their those types of things. A lot of the words that we're thinking about here are just ways of being, right? Encouraging and caring and friendly and engaging and motivating, all those types of activities. All right, we'll just count down for 10 more seconds. And thanks again for posting those ideas in there. And we'll come back to this in a little bit later on, but I wanted to go over a couple of things with you. So let's get back into our presentation here and we'll continue. Okay, so starting off with what is inclusive teaching? And a lot of you answered this and when we talked, you gave us some ideas about what you thought inclusive teaching was. And I know you'll notice here that I've just said inclusive teaching because inclusive teaching can be in for any mode, regardless if it's online or it's in class or it's blended. And there are many definitions. And here's one that comes from Brown University. And I just picked this one out of a hat. But if we look at it, we can see some things about it's explicit, it's intentional, and it means it's inclusion of all. So I think those are the most important areas there. That it's something that is needing to be practiced, needing to be nurtured, and it needs to be thoughtful. And so if we're thinking about our experience, about how we design our learning environments, and not only that, we're looking at content, we're looking at assessment, we're just looking at all the different parts that go into creating our learning environment, whether that be online, in class, blended, or whatever environment that you're teaching in. So that gives us an idea about what we mean by inclusive teaching. Now, what's important here is the role of the educator. And when I'm talking about online learning, in this context, I'm talking about facilitator-led. That means it's not learning that happens on someone's own or independent learning. This is something that is designed purposefully by a facilitator, an institution, and that has students and facilitator on a learning journey together. So if we look at the role, which is really critical, and we've heard a lot about roles perhaps in the past, you can see that when students come to an environment, especially if they're first time into an institution, there's a lot of different directions that they can be pulled. And so, you can look at the signpost there that's going in all different kinds of directions. And so the facilitator role is to guide that student towards a goal. And you can see on the right, it's a winding journey. It never goes in a straight line, but there is always a goal to achieve at the end, a shared purpose, and the facilitator can help guide that purpose. So you might have heard the term guide on the side, for example, in terms of an educator role, but that's not the only role that an online educator would have. The other one might be a mentor. Okay, so when we talk about guide on the side, there's also terms like mentor in the center. So when you say, I'm going to help that student achieve their goals, and so you're that helping hand, you're pulling everybody up to the outcomes that are to be achieved in that particular unit of instruction. There are other roles as well, and a lot of folks talk about moving beyond sage on the stage to guide on the side. But what we don't want to lose is the fact that sometimes we might have to be a sage on the stage, and there is a purpose for being that. The thing is, we just don't want to do that all the time. So it's a varied mix of different roles that we play at different times: sage on the stage, guide on the side, mentor in the center, that help our students to achieve their goals. All right. So I'm going to bump back for a quick one more question on here, and to see, and as we go on to the next question, let's go back into Menti, and we've got into our voting area. You can see the code there. You might still have it going on your phone or something, and maybe Abir can repost the link to the results. Think of a great learning experience that you've had, okay? So the last one was about a great teacher that you've had. What about a great learning experience? What made that experience great? Why was it memorable? So I'll just spend a couple more minutes on this one. What is it about that experience that made it resonate with you? Okay. All right. I'll just wait a couple of minutes as the inputs come in. Okay. All right. Okay, so here's a lot of things that are coming up here. The feeling of involvement, that you were in the learning process, that you were creating and doing something that was relevant, that was meaningful to you. It was a challenge. It doesn't always necessarily mean it's an easy experience, but you were challenged to do your very best, and it enabled that achievement. Okay. Okay. Stimulates thinking. Learning with technology integration. It was engaging. You were interacting with your peers through Zoom breakout sessions, those types of things. Okay. Good. I'll just give a couple more seconds on this one. Okay. And then someone in the chat mentioned about being able to then perform on their own without support, and becoming autonomous learners, perhaps, is brainstorming, equal opportunity, storytelling, okay, social experience. Good. Challenging assumptions, encouraging. Excellent. All right. So let's now take a look then at what are some principles of inclusive teaching. Now, there are many principles out there. I've just picked this particular one that comes from Columbia Center for Teaching and Learning, Columbia University. They've broken it down into 5. And a lot of the things that we've talked about and that you have already intuitively mentioned are here. So we think about what, as educators, we need to think about doing. So foster belonging for all. So not just for some, it's all. And I'll talk about what belonging means in a second. Setting explicit expectations. And those expectations can be clear, obviously, but also can be of a high standard as well. And students appreciate working towards a goal that has meaning. Third is recognizing diversity, acknowledging barriers, for sure. As we meant, if we think about that first question that I asked today about how you're feeling today, you can see that there's a tremendous amount of diversity in the answers there. Not everybody is the same. So, and again, it could be on a day-to-day basis that the feeling changes. So how do we acknowledge that? And what are the barriers to help students achieve those goals that we want them to achieve? Designing for accessibility. Absolutely. If we're going to take that first one, foster belonging for all, then everything that we do in terms of content, assessments, etc., need to be accessible for all. So what are some ideas, strategies that we can do to get that? And of course, the fifth one here is that notion of committing to inclusion. So if we're online inclusive educators and teachers, then it's a mindset, it's a way of being, it's an approach, a philosophy, if you like, and it becomes part of your teaching philosophy that I am going to be an inclusive educator as we go along. So let's look at each one of these in a little bit of detail. Now, of course, we're just, getting an overview here. There's so much more to each of these principles that this is just to give you a kind of an overview to get you started on this if you haven't seen or talked about this concept before. All right, so foster belonging for all. And, you could argue which is the most important of those. They're all important, but this one particularly resonates in that notion that you want to make sure that everyone that comes to your class is accepted for them, for being them. They come with all kinds of history, they come with all kinds of expectations, etc. And we're going to accept that and help them, because not only is everyone different, but they are all jumping into this learning journey together to reach a shared common goal, those outcomes for that particular course. Now, there is a difference. I need to point out a difference between belonging and fitting in. So we need to distinguish that. Fitting in means you're being accepted for, adhering to the norms of the classroom. Okay, so your acceptance and valuation is based on you fitting what the norm is for that particular classroom. Where belonging means that you're being accepted and valued for being you. That does not mean you don't fit in, but in this case, in this particular image that I've chosen here, you can see that there's peas in a pod. Most of them are green, but there's some individuals there. There's a red one. Okay, that's okay. You're all in there together, and that value and what you bring as an individual to that group is important. So there's a notion of community, and from that notion of community, I do want to bring in, this is something that came out of distance education from Garrison, Anderson, and Archer, and I think you probably might have seen this before. It's this notion of community of inquiry. And so looking at the presences that you have in that environment, and teaching presence, okay, social presence and cognitive presence, all equally important. And we may focus a little bit on maybe one or two of these. Maybe many of us are focusing on content and that cognitive presence engagement. Some are focusing on teaching presence, making sure that we, cover the content. We are there for our students, which is good, and which is great. But many of us might not then also put energy and effort into making that social presence happen. Because if it is a community, learning is a social activity, and we need to ensure that we have opportunities for students to engage in social pieces to our courses. Now, I've overlaid, this is not part of the community require framework, I've overlaid there some interaction pieces that I've crudely put into each of these bubbles instead of student-teacher interaction, student-student interaction, and student content interaction. They don't necessarily fit directly in each of those bubbles, but it's important to also note that do we provide those opportunities for interaction, those for students to students, students to the content, and students to the teacher, and asking ourselves, do we in our classes equally share the load between these three bubbles, or create opportunities between these three bubbles? And so that's a really important consideration to get that community involvement. All right, so let's look at some strategies perhaps for, and these are practical strategies. And what I'm going to do with the strategies, I'm listing 3 of them, but by any means, there's so many more that you can put into there. So I'm just picked a couple. So one of we talked about from us as educator is the notion of being authentic, being an authentic facilitator, and that means being you, right? You're belonging to this group as well. So let hopefully get to know one another out there. So you can do that through things like welcome videos, or just letting them be able to see you, letting them hear you, letting them be able to find out a little bit about you, where you're from, your background. Students really appreciate that, to know, uh, who is helping along the way in this journey. I talked about providing social spaces. So in our online courses, do we have discussion boards, perhaps called learner lounges, where students can just go and talk about anything that they want to talk about that adhere to our classroom norms. Obviously, we have some behaviors that we need to foster, and we need to model, but we need to provide those spaces for students to get together in and out, within the environment, and perhaps even ways that they can do that outside the environment. And again, this notion of a shared learning journey. And so that's co-creation is a really big part of this too, is, are you involving students in setting norms? What's going to happen in terms of schedule? How does everybody like, what's the preferred time for this or that, or the assessment, and those types of things. So involving your students as much as you can. Sometimes there's some practicalities around this, but those are just some ideas around principle number one, in that belonging. So as the educator, you're setting that tone, you're creating this environment and inviting others to come in and join you with it. So principle number two is notion of setting explicit expectations. And it flows from the creating this learning environment, in that you want to be absolutely clear. Students in online learning environments in particular always want to know, what is it you want me to do? When do you want me to do it? How do you want me to do it? So we need to be absolutely clear in terms of instructions, in terms of regular communication. We need to model the behaviors. We need to establish those netiquette guidelines, those conversation guidelines, those types of things. So some strategies, and again, I've only listed 3. There's so many more that can be done, but one of them for an online course, or any course really, is providing a course orientation. And this is in particular using a concept as an example here called liquid syllabus. Now, you may or may not have heard about this. It comes from work of Michelle Pacansy-Brock. And what that is, a liquid syllabus, it's really a website which contains a lot of information that you would normally see in the syllabus. But not only that, it's provided ahead of time. So students can get a sense before they come to the first class meeting, or before they decide to join that class. What are the expectations? Who is leading that? What are the assignments? Those types of things. What are the guidelines for behavior? All those types of things. And so you can do a lot to provide that sort of orientation to your course outside, so students can figure out on their own, do I want to come and belong to that community? And so that's a really interesting concept, and something that I think you'll see a lot more in future. So, and we talked here about the strategies about providing clear assessment instructions. So when we're talking about inclusion, we want the content to be accessible. I'll talk about that as well. But we also want to make sure that students have alternatives for how they express their knowledge, right? So that we provide, what is the exemplar that you're trying to achieve, that goal, that standard? How are you helping that student get there instructionally? What sort of checklists or rubrics are you providing to help them figure out what they need to include in that? And of course, us as online educators need to model what we're expecting from our students. So we'll go with our netiquette guidelines, we'll go with our discussion guidelines, and follow those, and so that students can understand how we're going to conduct our classrooms. All right. Principle 3. So this is recognizing diversity, acknowledging barriers. Now, we've seen this in the pandemic, the notion of barriers, right? In terms of internet access, in terms of devices, in terms of whatever, there's so many barriers there. But we need to be able to recognize that there's folks coming from all over the world. I'm teaching some classes now, and over 50% of my students are international students from all over the world. So there are different time zones. They have different pressures in terms of when they can come and how they can participate, etc. So first is the recognition of the diversity and valuing that diversity, what it brings to the classroom and the experience of others that you can leverage and take and help. Everybody can benefit from the experience of others. And then how do we acknowledge those barriers and make alternatives that will help our students? And so let's look at some strategies here. So when we're thinking that we are a global, you're thinking now that education is, in particularly a lot of institutions, it's a global experience now. It's not a local experience, although we do think, have a lot of local parts to our courses. We really need to bring in that global perspective, that worldview. And so the resources that we pick, are we curating world resources? Are we picking from a variety of different ideas out there in the world, different cultures? Are we what are we asking students to look at in terms of resources, those types of things, to make sure that they are as diverse as our students and they're representative of our students, because they feel that, that resonates with me because I have lived that experience. Do we invite feedback? And this notion of ongoingness. If we are in a class, nothing is ever set. And I think that's the new reality in our world. Nothing is ever set. Just there's room for change on an ongoing basis. We can invite feedback. We don't have to wait to the end of a course. What's working for you in this class? What's not? What changes would you like to see made? And then, of course, acting on those changes. And the other one is the notion of open educational resources. Now, one of the, cost is a huge barrier for a lot of students in post-secondary environment. So how can we find alternatives? One of the things I do in my course is I do have a certain resource, a textbook, but I also provide an alternative textbook that is an open educational resource for students that perhaps have some financial constraints and they need to have an alternative other than purchasing what has always been the textbook for that course, but curating these other resources as well. Okay. Design for accessibility. This is really, really important. And again, that kind of flows again from that principle 3, the notion of barriers. And if there is that brick wall or that door that's locked that a student can't get through, then their motivation is going to decrease. Their participation is going to obviously drop out. So what we need to do is provide that key or alternative for them to participate. And so this brings in this notion of universal design for learning. And I think many of you might have seen this before, but designing upfront so that we have multiple means of representation, so that you provide multimedia content, something for them to watch, something for them to read, something for them to listen to. You provide multiple means of engagement so that, they can, they have some choice about how they want to express their knowledge. Okay, they have some choice around, relevance and how they're reflecting about their learning journey. All that type of stuff. Multiple means of action and expression, so that you're varying the ways in which you present the content, etc. So this notion of universal design for learning means that you're designing upfront. We're not retrofitting after the fact. I mean, that happens a lot. There's no doubt about that. But if we have the luxury of starting a new course or designing upfront, if we design with universal design for learning in mind, it really benefits everyone. And you think about accessibility as well. And now, to be clear, accessibility and UDL are not the same thing. A lot of people think of them as being synonymous, but they're not. Accessibility is part of UDL. So UDL is about focusing on everyone. Okay, so focusing up front for everyone, regardless of their any previous impairment or challenge that they have. Whereas accessibility means that you're focusing and providing accommodations for students that might have a sensory, physical, or cognitive impairment. So again, designing for all. And we saw that at the beginning when we talked about belonging for all. So strategies here is the notion of implementing UDL. So if you haven't done so yet, when we're looking at our checklists for designing our courses, having a piece on UDL, have you included UDL pieces in your courses? A very practical one is making your documents and resources accessible. Now I see this all the time, is when faculty upload documents or present videos or what content in their courses, have they checked them through like an accessibility checker? Word has an accessibility checker in it. PowerPoint has an accessibility checker in it that comes with Office 365. When you provide a video, do you have closed captioning available so students that might have a hearing impairment can read along and follow the content? Or somebody who doesn't have a hearing impairment but maybe is in an environment, they're on the bus or they're at home in a busy household, they just need to turn off the volume and they just need to turn on closed captioning so they can access the material. And of course, if at the end, it's providing those alternatives, not just one way for them to get that content. Is there multiple ways that they can go in there and get the content to reach those learning outcomes? Very important part. All right, I know I'm looking at the clock and I just want to move on to get to our Q&A very, very shortly. But I want to just cover principle number 5, which is then onus on us as educators is commitment to inclusion. And again, this global perspective that we are going to take on this mindset, and it's something that you embrace. It's an approach, it's a way of being. So you say, when I'm doing my courses, how are my students involved? Okay. Have I asked them, what could make this environment more inclusive for them? Where we can. And so some things that we can do, obviously ongoing reflection, the notion of the reflective practitioner. So we can, again, I can't stress enough this notion of ongoingness, so that it's something that it's not done. It's always something that we can do to improve inclusivity. Participate in PD like you're doing now through great things like the EdTech Lounge or courses or whatever PD is available. And the other thing I just really would stress is sharing experiences. Now, you did a little bit of that earlier when we asked you to share what you thought of inclusive teaching, all that kind of stuff. But then just having those conversations with your colleagues around, what are you doing in inclusive education? How are you making your courses more inclusive? So let's then jump into our final activity. And what I'd like to ask, question that I'm asking is, let me know, what is inclusive teaching idea or strategy that you've heard of today that you'll implement in your online courses? What is the one takeaway that from today that you would like to try? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that, and then go ahead and post that in the in our Mentimeter board here. And thank you, Abir, for posting the link back in there. Okay. Good. All right. Excellent. I know it's a quick overview, and there's lots of information there, and it's hard to kind of pick one, but really one of the things that we can do is if we just concentrate on one to start and implement that, then we're ahead of the game. We can feel a sense of accomplishment moving forward. And then we can just build on that, that ongoingness as we go from there. So a lot of you are looking at that accessibility option about making your resources accessible and closed captions for videos. And somebody wants to look at open education resources, great. Social forum for students, for sure, absolutely. Setting those kind of tone for that classroom. All right, I'll just give you another few seconds to post in there. Let me set the countdown clock there. I know folks are perhaps getting a little tired as we move on at the end here. Okay. Good. All right. Thank you for that. So to wrap up our session today, what I was going to do is just point you to some resources and next steps. And I know at AKU and QTL and BDL, they've got lots of great resources for you. And the one that is available right now, there's an Essentials of Online Course Design and Facilitation learning manual, self-help learning manual. In there, it speaks a lot about UDL and inclusive teaching, not maybe explicitly in some areas, but a lot of the strategies and techniques that are mentioned in there and steps walk you through that type of process for when you're designing your course. And I do want to give a shout out and let you know about upcoming courses program that's going to be offered called Online Teaching in Higher Education. And one of the courses in there is on inclusive teaching and universal design for learning as well. So you might want to think about that if you're thinking about those PD options that are coming up.